All right, so good morning. Today we are going to be covering some concepts of strength and power. Um, Again, like Marcy or Vic will tell you, you're more than welcome to slide over to the baseball weight room anytime if you have any questions or concerns about the presentation. Always open to talk shop, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions or concerns. So first off, kind of to cover kind of what strength is, what power is, and how we kind of differentiate the two, and kind of how we prioritize each during whatever phase, block, or time of year we may be training. So to start, strength is the ability to overcome resistance of an object. Basically, the amount of force equals mass times acceleration is kind of the formula that I'll look at whenever we're looking at strength. So essentially, the amount of mass we can use and the ability to accelerate it. Secondarily, power is the ability to exert force in the shortest period of time. So the biggest difference, you're going to find between strength and power is that time piece in there. Power is really focused on producing high levels of outputs in a really, really short period of time. Um, how do we prioritize the two? I'd say it depends on the athlete, depends on the training age, depends on their injury history, and we'll kind of get into that when we look at a little bit of needs analysis later. But that at least gives you an idea of, strength is force equals mass times acceleration, power equals work over time. One is really focused on the amount of force we produce in the shortest period of time, whereas strength is really just able to overcome high levels of resistance. So some of the key performance indicators that I'll use for each of these, and it is going to change depending on, sport, but the big ones I've always done throughout my career for our bilateral lower body movements, total body movements, I'm going to go trap bar deadlift. I've done back squats and front squats are really my big bilateral movements that I've looked at in regards to, training for strength. Unilateral work has been something that over the last 2 or 3 years I've implemented significantly larger amounts of in my programming compared to what I would have done probably 10 years ago. We train split squat, we'll train reverse lunge, and we'll train oftentimes rear foot elevated split squats as a strength indicator for our student athletes here at Mississippi State. Our key indicators for power, there's so many different variations, so many ways to train power. But Olympic variations are obviously really popular. I've utilized them in the past with track and field athletes, women's soccer athletes. I tend to steer clear of them with my baseball athletes at this point. And as you'll see, I kind of hit more medicine ball variations because we're able to train through multiple planes, multiple range of motions. Typically, going to be easier to coach in large group settings, and is going to be more sport specific to each athlete, depending on kind of what planes they work in the most. We'll do force plate testing, jump mat testing. Basically, look at that ability to produce force in that vertical plane. We'll look at jump height, peak power, and I really work a lot with Michael to red flag any of our guys who have certain power detriments from week to week, specifically in season, is when we're looking at that. And last thing for my performance indicators for power is going to be plyometric testing. We're looking at plyometrics in multiple different planes, whether it's vertical, horizontal, frontal plane, rotational plane. I'm a really big fan of any sort of plyometrics, any sort of medicine ball variation is really what I'll hammer home with our baseball athletes. And as you'll see at the bottom, how do we choose? It's going to vary based off sport, based off the individual needs analysis, based off injury history, what position they play, their training age. So there's a ton of factors that go into how we choose exercise for our athletes for strength and power. And also, at what point is an athlete going to have enough strength, and do we really steer clear of really pushing strength to gain that 5, 10 more pounds on a back squat, front squat, trap bar deadlift, or do we just learn them or teach them how to move lighter loads at a really high clip? So programming variables, and this is really what's going to dictate, the adaptation you're getting whenever training athletes. So we're going to look at intensity, so the energy requirement based on imposed demands. The way we'll look at intensity and how I measure it is going to be rate of RPE, rate of perceived exertion, reps in reserve. We'll use percentage-based programming, and the biggest one that I've used over the last 2 years is our velocity-based training. Majority of my programming is going to be either percentage-based, velocity-based training, or a combination of the both. Um, Secondarily, volume, the total amount of work or load being moved during that training session. It can be total tonnage, so the total amount of weight used. It can be total repetitions for that day, but also a lot of people will forget the total time under tension for each rep as they accumulate as you go through your sets each day. So those are three ways that I'll monitor volume with our athletes. And lastly, how often are we training? What's the frequency? How many times per week? What exercise frequency, and what is the amount of rest between each sets? Because that'll really, affect the adaptation that we have if we're not allowing for optimal rest periods between each set. So those are three programming variables that are really, really, dictate what your adaptation is going to be for each exercise. This is Prelevin chart. So if you're going with a percentage-based program, I always love to go back and look at this chart. Again, it's hard to explain without me being in person. So again, any questions, concerns, feel free to come over to the baseball weight room. But it's a great way to look at a percentage in that far left column, look at reps per set in that second from left column, look at the optimal total number of reps that could be done per set or total on the day, sorry, and then the range that should fall into, low end volume, high end volume for what percentage you're training at. So again, if you need any questions, Victor or myself can answer those questions regarding that chart. Velocity-based training. So I know each Shira and the baseball weight room both utilize Vitruve. I've started using velocity-based training a lot for several reasons. And I'll kind of go over the pros and cons of each. Number one pro being it allows us to auto-regulate. Auto-regulate means that we are able to adjust the training session, the training numbers, the variables of intensity, volume, and frequency based off the speed the bar moves that day. It'll take into account outside stressors on the field. It will take into account outside stress in the classroom, personal lives, and then obviously the stress that we're going to implement in the weight room. So it really allows us to monitor that and make sure that we're training in the right zones for that day, and allows me to be more precise with any training adaptation we're doing. Another huge pro is anytime we're in the weight room, I want our athletes training with obviously high intent with every movement, but also high level of competition. Anytime we're putting a number on something, it allows our athletes to compete with each other, which obviously gives us a more intense training adaptation. With that being said, there are cons, when we're looking at velocity based training. The high training intent is great until it obviously affects the quality of movement you're doing. We want our training intent to be great, but we also want the technique and the quality of the movement pattern that we're doing to match that training intent. So that's a huge negative if it's not if the movements aren't trained and coached to a high level. You need trustworthy athletes that are going to maximize every rep depending on how they feel that day. You don't need athletes telling you they're hurting and just trying to move the bar slower than they're actually capable of that day. So you need your athletes to be trustworthy. And then the last con is it can be a time consuming setup. And organization can be a little bit tricky, but my guys are really good at buying into what we're really trying to do with the velocity based training. They train with pretty good quality movement patterns. They train with high intent, and they do a great job of competing every day. So I really like the velocity based training that we're doing in combination with kind of how I program it with our percentages. So RP and reps in reserve. RP stands for rate of perceived exertion, and RIR stands for reps in reserve. Both of them are kind of the same thing. Good, easy ways to really monitor stress and fatigue. Uh, RP essentially is a 1 to 10 scale, 10 being really hard, 1 being really easy. And you can basically judge how your athletes feel based off that 1 to 10 scale. Reps in reserve is essentially each set, you can leave 2, 3, or 4 reps in reserve. You can adjust that for each athlete and the weight that they're training at, and really allow them to, cut off sets whenever they feel like they have 2, 3, or 4 reps left in the tank. I think there are a lot of cons in regard to RP and RIR. A lot of times you're going to see poor movement quality late in sets because athletes think that they can do more than they're able to do. They have high egos and excessive confidence that will lead to them thinking that they have more reps in the tank than they actually have left. So that's a huge negative. They don't understand oftentimes accurate fatigue levels. They don't really understand what a true 10 is, or a true 8. So that's where it can be a little tricky if they don't understand, the fatigue level for themselves. And then last, like every of the all of these, a con is always, hey, you have to have trustworthy athletes that understand their body, understand the training adaptation you're going for, and how to train, through fatigue. So early strength training focus. I think my foundation block is probably the most important block that I'm going to get with our student athletes. Typically, that foundation block is going to be the first, 4 to 6 weeks of training with the athlete that I've ever worked with them before. I get a really good idea of what they do well, what they don't do well, and that will really set up, how we're going to program there as we move forward and try to really progress them in the weight room. During that foundation block, I have several goals. One's creating high level movement competency with all the movements we're doing. I need everything to be done with excellent technique, excellent attention to detail, and excellent intent. We're going to use really sub-maximal loads early on in training and really focus on the details of how we're going to do all of our movements, whether it's our squats, our RDLs, our hinge patterns, our pushes, our pulls, um, our plyometrics. Anything we're doing needs to be done with great detail. And the biggest thing about that foundation block with our untrained athletes is you're going to see so many neurological adaptations and movement quality improvements just by simply exposing them to basic foundational movements every single day. You'll see so much improvement so quick, not necessarily from muscle mass improvement, but strictly because their neurological system's adapting and their movement quality is improving, which allows them to move weight most optimal. So, what are the staples of our program here? I kind of hit on them already. Our squat pattern, front squat, hands-free front squat, safety bar squat, are the big bilateral movements that I'm looking at. Unilateral, we're looking our split squat and reverse lunge are the two that I really hammer home with our guys. Our hinge pattern is always going to be our RDL. We start off double leg, really progress double leg until we can't see any more progression or feel like we don't need to, and then we'll move to either dynamic effort movements or single leg movements that revolve a little bit more stability. Upper body, the two big movements we're looking at are going to be push-ups. Our athletes should be able to dominate push-ups. They should be able to allow their head, hip, and knees to all raise up at the same time, and allow that scap to wrap around the rib cage at the top every single rep. Upper pulls, chin ups, or pull downs done at a high level. So we're getting our pulling done there. And then last but not least, staples of our program is the ability to teach bracing for all our big movements, but also a ton of pelvic control, whether it's anterior to posterior or that rotational transverse plane. I want our athletes to be able to control their pelvis, control their glutes, and allow their bodies to be able to be put in really good positions to manage heavy load. So those are kind of some of the staples of our program. We always start our athletes, when in doubt, I treat them like they've never touched a weight before, and then gradually progress them nice and slow, because at the end of the day, we have plenty of time with our athletes throughout the semester to progress them. So always kind of err on the side of lighter and work your way up from there. How do we program for strength? So first off, how to calculate a 1RM. So there's so many ways to do this, whether it's velocity-based training, equations, or just working up to a 1RM, a 3RM, or a 5RM. Typically, the two that I'll lean towards is velocity-based training with our Vitruve units gives us estimated 1 rep maxes, which obviously isn't going to be exactly dead on, spot on accurate, but it allows you a really good value to go off of with your new athletes to really have a good training value to move forward with. Epley's equation, which is essentially going to be weight times reps times 0.03 plus the weight on the bar. Pretty easy equation that's usually going to be pretty accurate. And then last but not least, the 1RM, the 3RM, or the 5RM are going to be obviously really accurate, but you're also going to be at a higher risk of injury whenever you are doing rep maxes, especially if you see a technical breakdown. What volume and intensity are we going at? So generally speaking, majority of my sets and reps are going to be falling between sets of 1 to 5 for 1 to 5 sets. And usually majority of our training is going to take place at that 70 to 85%. There are times where we're working 90% to 100%, but it's very few and far between. And There are times where we are training at less than 70%, whether it's early on in the foundation block or if we're doing dynamic effort. Also, other factors that will affect volume and intensity are going to be our in season versus off season. How many innings are our athletes playing? Every athlete's going to be on a little different program, dictated based off injury history, based off the amount of innings they're playing, and things of that nature. And last thing, another thing to take into account is going to be male versus female. How do male athletes handle volume and intensity versus how do female athletes handle volume and intensity, and how do we program for them? Early power training focus. So again, like I said, I'm a big fan of Olympic movements. Just because I work with a baseball program that doesn't do them doesn't mean I don't see a ton of value in them. Some of the pros that you'll see with Olympic movements are going to be, high power outputs. You're having to absorb force when you catch the bar, lots of inter and intramuscular coordination, and then you have that violent hip extension. But also, there's so many different derivatives of Olympic movements that you can do, whether it's not a catch, whether it's from the hang, from blocks. There's so many different variations and derivatives that you can do that it does provide you a lot of options for your athletes. Some of the cons, like anything, if it's poorly coached slash programmed, it's not going to be optimal for power training. It can be time consuming to teach. And lastly, it can have a higher risk of injury than some of your other options like medicine ball rotations or medicine ball throws and your plyometrics. But oftentimes, if it's coached at a high level, programmed at a high level, you're going to see tons of improvements. Like any movement, there's always a risk of injury. But I think if you're optimally coaching it and optimally programming it, you're going to see a lot of benefits. Plyometric training. So any sort of jumping that we're doing, multiplanar jumping, um, sprinting is a huge plyometric that we do in our program. They are easy to teach. You can hammer multiple planes, and it's going to be quote unquote more sport specific. All right. The reason I say that is because at the end of the day, our athletes, whenever they're on the field, they're not going to have a barbell in their hands. They're not going to have a medicine ball in their hands. They're just going to be able to have to manipulate and have proprioception of their body. So I think plyometrics are, one thing that over the last 3 to 5 years, I've heavily, introduced more, whether it's in our warm-ups, whether it's in supersets, whatever it may be. Um, I've done them a lot more. Some of the negatives, again, poor intent. You're not going to get maximal training adaptation if they don't have high effort, high intent. And you do have a limited eccentric overload strictly because you're only managing your body weight. You can do some plyometric, some jump training with weight in hand, but a lot of times it does, not have that eccentric overload that you're really looking for to train that tissue, train the ligaments, train the tendons. How do you decide? I think again, a lot of it's based off training age. A lot of it's going to be based off the sport they're playing and what, are the highest injury risk for that sport. Again, I don't think they're both great options, but those are two that you see utilized the most. Third, I would say would be our medicine ball training because it does allow you to hammer multiple ranges and multiple planes very, very easily. Moving on. Like I said earlier, how do we program for power? Kind of gave you a couple options with, the cleans, the plyometrics, and the medicine balls. But first things first, I'm looking at dynamic and ballistic effort exercise variations. So jumps, throws, sprints, and Olympic lifts are the biggest ones that I'm looking for whenever we're training our athletes. We want our athletes to one lift, we want them to jump, and we want them to sprint because that's going to be the most demand that they see on the field. We want it to be in multiple planes, whether it's frontal plane, sagittal plane, transverse plane. We need our athletes to have high levels of proprioception and be able to manipulate their bodies in space. Intensity and volume. It's going to dictate based off, what exercises you're choosing for jumps, medicine balls, sprints, and Olympic lifts. But generally speaking, we're looking at 1 to 3 reps of sets of 4 to 6, similar to kind of our strength movements. But with that said, when you're doing that low volume and low number of sets and total volume, we need the intensity to be really high. So Olympic lifts, you're typically looking at 70 to 80%. Any sort of dynamic effort barbell work, I'm typically looking at 45 to 60%. And then obviously when we're training body weight plyometrics, we need the intent to be done at a high level. Accommodated resistance for barbell work. I've become a huge fan the last year, 2 year of doing a lot of our chain work in season because it will take stress off the joints and the bottom of the movement, but also it allows you to accelerate the bar through the entire movement as opposed to having to decelerate because there's not enough load at the top. The bands and the chains will increase resistance at the top of the movement. So the last 2 years, specifically in season, I've utilized our chains a ton because of, better in the joints and allows us to move, you know, higher weights at faster speeds. Vertical integration. So this is kind of like a fancy term for, undulating programming. I know you've probably done some research on block periodization, undulating periodization, linear periodization, whatever it may be. But Charlie Francis essentially came up with this model of vertical integration, a well-renowned Canadian track and field coach. Basically, high and low CNS days, bucketing your high CNS intensive days, and then bucketing your extensive low intensity days, and really trying to make sure that you're optimizing your program from how you structure your high days to your low days, and blending all your training philosophies so that no athletic component goes untrained. You're just emphasizing or de-emphasizing one depending on that time of year. So in season, we're really looking at higher levels of power output, less strain on the joints. So we're looking at some of our partial range of motion movements. We're looking at some of our band resisted movements, chain resisted movements, looking for higher level power outputs, but we're still not neglecting our strength work on specific movements. So again, you're training all athletic qualities, but you are going to emphasize some a little more than others, depending on the athlete, depending on the time of year, and the innings that they are playing. Programming parameters. Again, I've already kind of hit on a lot of these, but really, it's one of the trickiest things is kind of understanding what you have to work with and being able to mold your program around that. I'm fortunate enough over here to have a full weight room. We have 100 yards worth of turf, so I have so many pieces at my disposal to be able to program. So the biggest parameters I'm looking at are going to be sport demand / time of year. Are they in season or are they off season? What are the big rocks, the big exercises that we need to focus on to really, see improvement long term with our athletes? And what are the mandatories? What are the exercises that I have to hit within each training session or the exercise that I have to hit within each week? And really put a high emphasis on what do we have to have and really take out a lot of the fluff that over the last 5 to 10 years that I've had in my programs and just hit what do we have to have, and do that at a high level. Other parameters will include on-field demands. When are you training, whether it's before practice or after practice? What sort of time restrictions do you have? Do we have 30 minutes with our athletes? Do you have an hour and 30 minutes with your athletes? That can be tricky. Floor space and equipment restrictions. Not everyone's going to be fortunate enough to have a weight room. Not everyone's going to be fortunate enough to have a weight room to themselves to where they're not going to have other athletes from other sports in the room. So take that in always into account when you're writing your program. The number of athletes that you're going to have on the floor at one time. If you're going to be having 50 kids on the floor versus if you're going to have 5 on the floor, you're going to obviously program a little bit different for strength and power. And last thing, this is probably what adjusts majority of our guys' programs is going to be their injury history. What injuries have they had? How does that limit them? And what are some exercises that we can choose that are going to, strengthen what we need to strengthen to reduce the risk of that injury moving forward? So, kind of going over some ways of periodizing strength. So, you're looking at a 4 week off season strength block and a 4 week in season strength block. You can see from week 1 to week 3, we're increasing by 5% each week, and we are decreasing the total volume um, of each day from 20 reps to 16 to 12. And then we go into a deload week where I drop off 12.5% to do a 3x3, which is going to be really low volume. Basically, allow our athletes to do great quality movement, but with less load and less volume so that whenever we get back to that first week of our training block, we're really ready to go. So you'll kind of see an undulating programming there. Looking below at a 4 week in-season strength block, you're going from 70% and you're working up to 82.5% week 1 to 3. You're going from 15 reps week 1 to 12 reps week 2 to 3 reps week 9. And then that deload week, we are backing off 15% to 67.5%, and we're doing 3x4, which again is still pretty low volume for 67.5%. A lot of this will be adjusted based off, how the athlete feels that day and what their velocity based training looks like. Some other strength training methods that I've used are going to be cluster sets. So essentially, you're taking a set week one. You have three sets of two plus two plus two. So the first set of two you do at 80%. You'll wait 20 seconds. You'll do another set of two. You'll wait 20 seconds, do the last set of two, and then you'll wait 120 seconds before you do that full cluster again. As we progress from week one to week three, we'll decrease a rep at each cluster from a 3 by 2 by 2 by 2 to a 3 by 2 by 1 by 1, but we will increase to 85%, keeping the rest periods the same. And then for week three, we go 3 by 1 dash 1 dash 1 at 90% with the same rest as before. And then, as I did every other one, that fourth week, we're going to do a deload week at 75%, going clusters of 2, 2, 2. When and why would this be a great time to utilize clusters? When and why? I do them a lot in the off season. I think they're a great way of training strength. I think it allows you to have a higher quality movement pattern because as opposed to doing three sets of six where technique can break down, you're able to do three sets of six, but you're breaking it up into twos, which allows one, higher power outputs, and better technique. So I'm a huge fan of any sort of cluster sets. And it's a great way to keep your athletes organized if you do have a large number of athletes on the floor. And then secondarily, we have wave loading. So you'll look at wave one. You have a set of five at 75%, set of two at 80%, set of one at 85%. And then that same day, you'll do a second wave. You'll increase 5%. So you'll go one by five at 80%, one by three at 85%, and one by one at 90%. So a good part about this is you're getting a little bit of that post-activation potentiation from hitting 85% and then dropping back down to, 80% and gradually increasing up to 90%. So I think these are two great methods of strength training that are easy methods to program. Undulating program for Olympic lifting. So whenever you're writing your Olympic lifting programs, the percentages are going to be very different than what you would program for strength training. They're typically going to be a lot lower. As you can look at this program, week one, I'll start off at 70%. We're going to increase by 5% between week one to week three. So we'll go week one, 70%, week two, 75, week three, 80%. Week one, we're going 12 reps total. Week two, you're going 3 by 3, 9 reps total. And last week, you were going 5 by 1. So as you can see, kind of as you increase, intensity, we're going to decrease volume, and then we'll allow for a deload week. Trap bar jump progression. If you have athletes who aren't great at Olympic lifts, trap bar jumps are a great alternative, and you can kind of program them the same way. Your percentages may be a little bit different, but trap bar jumps are a great alternative for Olympic lifting. They're not the exact same, adaptations you're going to get, but it's a great option. Broad jump and vertical jump progressions. How can we progress plyometrics? A lot of times you'll see coaches repeat broad jump on broad jump on broad jump from week to week to week and not progress. So with my athletes, I always work extensive to intensive. We're going to increase contacts and repetitions early for technique. So we'll decrease, intensity, increase volume, understand the positions their body needs to be in, and we'll gradually progress on intensity and reduce the volume as we go from week to week. We can also progressively overload any movements with bands or weights. Bands increase reactivity, increase the eccentric overspeed, which is going to, help with all of our tendon and ligament adaptations that we're looking for. And you can also progress from body weight to dumbbell to barbell jumps. There's so many different progressions that you can make with movements like trap bar jumps or broad jumps. They're both great and alternatives to some Olympic lifts if that's a route you don't want to go. You can work single contact to multiple contact. You can work single plane to multiple plane, and we can work bilateral to unilateral. So single contact being one rep, relax, do another rep. Multiple contacts means stringing each rep into the other without a stop. Single plane to multiplanar, we can go frontal to horizontal or frontal to sagittal plane. You can go rotational to sagittal plane. You can change the planes of the plyometrics you're working in. And lastly, you can go bilateral to unilateral. Another power method that we'll look at is post-activation potentiation. So PAP is the increased ability to exert higher forces and increased rate of force development with non-fatiguing contractions. So programming strength exercises with high intensity plyometrics is a great way to get a lot of work done in a short period of time, but also it can be really fatiguing on athletes if you're not giving optimal rest periods. One of the most, I guess, famous versions of PAP is going to be your French contrast method. So it's going to be a compound lift. So squat is a good example. Trap bar deadlift for a set of 2 to 3 repetitions at 80%. A body weight high force plyometric, so a box jump, followed by a speed strength movement, a dumbbell jump, and then an overload over speed plyometric with a band assisted jump. So basically, between each of these, you'll rest 20 seconds. Between each set, you'll give 120 seconds rest. When and why? I think this is a great piece for in season because it's low volume. You can really keep the volume low. You're going to get high power outputs, and you're training every part of that force velocity curve, from slow movements to those overspeed plyometric movements. So I really like these if you're looking for high levels of power output, in season. Any questions? Like I said when I first started, you are more than welcome to come over to the baseball weight room anytime. Marcy has my contact information, so any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out. It was good chatting with y'all. Have a great day.